The night the water came. I was standing on my porch, coffee gone cold in my hand, watching the floodlights flicker on and off across the marsh below. By dawn, the entire HOA neighborhood sat under 3 feet of salt water, cars floating like forgotten toys, banners from their wine and jazz festival twisting in the wind. People screamed for help from the same streets where, just months earlier, they'd called me paranoid. And there I was, dry and safe on my hill, the man they mocked for warning them. My name's Calvin Harlow, a retired coastal engineer who spent 30 years studying the way land and water dance, and what happens when people pretend they can choreograph nature. When I bought my small plot outside the HOA boundary, I thought I was leaving that madness behind. Just me, my workshop, and the sound of birds at dawn. But the moment the HOA built those pastel homes down by the tidal flats, flatland that should have stayed wild, I knew it was only a matter of time before trouble rolled in with the tide. The HOA called themselves Bay Ridge Estates, a luxury waterfront community. What they really were was a monument to arrogance. The president, Linda Prescott, strutted around like she owned the coastline itself, tight, blonde bun, manicured nails sharp enough to draw blood, and a smile that said she'd never been told no in her life. She treated the bylaws like the Bible and herself as the preacher. The first time I spoke up was at a community forum. I wasn't even part of their HOA. I lived right next to them, but they invited neighboring property owners to discuss shoreline maintenance. I brought data, maps, tide projections, even erosion charts. When I started explaining how the waterline had crept inland over the past decade, Linda cut me off with that syrupy tone of hers. "So what you're saying, Mr. Harlow, is that you think our homes will just float away?" Her board members laughed. I tried to keep calm. "I'm saying your seawall is ungraded. Your drainage system funnels water straight toward the marsh, and you're cutting into protected mangroves that—" She raised a hand, smiling like she was swatting a fly. "Thank you. Your passion is noted." That night, a copy of their HOA newsletter landed in my mailbox. Headline: Local retiree spreads fear at community meeting. No names, but they didn't need to. My phone stopped ringing. Neighbors I'd chatted with at the hardware store turned away. It was subtle at first. Then came the graffiti, green paint on my back fence spelling bitter. Same shade they used on the HOA benches. I wish I could say I didn't care, but I did. For months, I felt like a ghost walking through my own town. I emailed city officials. I called the county. Even tried to get an environmental inspection. Nothing. The HOA had lawyers on retainer and friends on every board. When I mailed Linda a certified report about erosion rates and drainage violations, she returned it unopened, stamped refused. That's when I realized this wasn't ignorance. It was denial. And denial has consequences. Then came the day they cut down the mangroves, the last natural barrier between their neighborhood and the rising tide. I stood behind my fence, fists clenched, watching crews tear through roots that had held the coastline together for centuries. Chainsaws screamed. Branches fell. Linda stood nearby with her coffee cup, nodding approval like a queen overseeing a beheading. That was the day I stopped trying to save them and started preparing to save myself. I reinforced my property, dug drainage ditches, raised my generator, sealed my workshop wiring 3 feet above grade. Quietly, methodically, and still. Part of me hoped I was wrong. But in March, a minor nor'easter grazed the coast, didn't even make landfall. Yet the water crept halfway up their driveways. The HOA blamed weather anomalies, and posted drone photos cropped tight to hide the puddles. Behind the screens and newsletters, people were starting to whisper. One woman stopped me outside the feed store. "Do you really think it'll flood again?" she asked, voice trembling. "I don't think," I told her. "I know." That's when the cease and desist letter came. 6 pages from a Tallahassee law firm, accusing me of causing undue anxiety among residents. They demanded I stop contacting the HOA and refrain from discussing matters of community governance. I stood in my kitchen reading it while the kettle screamed behind me. I didn't even turn it off right away. That noise fit the moment perfectly. Pressure building until something had to give. For the first time, I thought about giving up. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was just an old man chasing storms. The whole town thought I was crazy anyway. But a week later, a young city planner showed up at my door, said his name was Felix Gutierrez. He looked nervous, glancing over his shoulder before stepping inside. He spread out satellite maps and risk assessments on my kitchen table, FEMA overlays marked in red. "These are internal documents," he whispered. "They haven't been released yet, but Bay Ridge's board already saw them. They knew their development was in a flood zone. They even filed paperwork using your land as a runoff basin, without your consent." I stared at the map, heat rising in my chest. "They modeled my property as a catch basin?" He nodded. "They claimed you were undeveloped land that would absorb overflow if the retention ponds failed." That night, something changed in me. The bitterness turned into focus. I wasn't fighting ignorance anymore. I was fighting corruption. So I started other workshops. Small, quiet, in my garage. Emergency prep for coastal storms. I called them. No mention of the HOA. Just flashlights, maps, tide charts, and survival tips. The first week, 6 people came. By the third, there were 20 folding chairs lined up down the driveway. One of them was Marcy Delaney, realtor, HOA member by marriage, sharp woman, loyal type. But you could see the cracks forming behind her polite smile. When I showed them the updated flood maps, the real ones, not the HOA's doctored versions, Marcy's jaw tightened. "That's not what they gave us when we bought the house," she said quietly. "They gave you the 2012 maps," I replied. "These are 2023 projections." They knew. Marcy. They built anyway. She didn't argue. She just nodded, took a flash drive I handed her, and whispered, "Let's see what happens when the others find out." Within a week, rumors spread like wildfire. Contractors pulled out of projects. Homeowners started asking real questions at board meetings. Then one morning, I found a thick binder in my mailbox, no return address. Inside were HOA emails, meeting notes, and one document that made my stomach turn. Flood Plan Contingency, Non-Disclosure Strategy. It laid out exactly how they'd cover up flood risks, spin the story, and discredit me by name. That was the last straw. I scanned every page, uploaded it all to a private cloud, and sent the link to every resident who'd ever attended my workshops. No caption, no commentary, just truth. 2 days later, Linda herself showed up at my door with her lawyer. Her voice was sugar-coated rage. "Mr. Harlow, you're spreading confidential material. You've caused panic." I just looked at her, calm. "No, panic was your business model. I'm just handing out the receipts." She turned pale. For once, she had no script. And then came the storm. It started slow, a high tide. Wind from the southeast. Nothing out of the ordinary. But by midnight, the seawall groaned, water sliding through the gaps where mangroves once stood. I stood on the edge of my property, flashlight cutting through the mist. watching it creep over the walking trails, over the decorative pavers, into the Calais des Sacs. At 1:30 a.m., I got a call from Raj, one of my workshop guys. "It's in the garage. Cal, the water's in the damn garage." "Get your kids upstairs," I told him. "Turn off your breakers. Don't wait for help. It's not coming." By 3 a.m., half the neighborhood was underwater. Sirens wailed. Someone's car alarm went off and never stopped. I watched from my hill as people waded through waist-deep water, clutching their kids, their pets, their disbelief. And then Linda went live on the HOA Facebook page, standing barefoot in her flooded kitchen, pretending everything was under control. Behind her, water rippled across her tile floor. The video went viral before she could delete it. By dawn, over 30 people had reached my property, soaked, shaking, carrying whatever they could. I didn't gloat, didn't say, "I told you so." I just handed out blankets and hot coffee. But the worst wasn't over. Meteorologists announced a king tide approaching, one of the biggest in decades. And Bay Ridge had no drainage left. They'd built over it. The city had no pumps available. The next surge would finish what denial had started. That night, I turned my crank radio to 88.9 FM and spoke into the mic. "This is Calvin Harlow on Timber Rise. If you're still in Bay Ridge Estates, get to higher ground. The tide is coming. We've got shelter, food, and light. Don't wait." They came. Families in pickup trucks, canoes, even a man pushing his wife and daughter on a makeshift raft. Everyone except the HOA board. They stayed behind in the model home, thinking elevation meant safety. At 4:37 a.m., a kayak appeared in the floodwater. 2 people inside. Linda and her husband. She was half conscious, drenched, her perfect hair plastered to her face. I helped pull her out, wrapped her in a thermal blanket, and carried her to the barn. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The ocean had already said everything. When rescue helicopters finally came, they found our hill packed with families, over 100 people sharing food, keeping warm. The HOA clubhouse stood half submerged, its sign barely visible above the brown water. Bay Ridge Estates, coastal living redefined. I couldn't help but laugh at that. A week later, when the water finally receded, the state dissolved the HOA. No big press release, no lawsuit spectacle, just a quiet government notice. Bay Ridge Estates Homeowners Association is no longer recognized as an active corporate entity. Linda resigned and left town. Her house, once the pride of the coast, sat gutted and hollow, drywall warped like the shell of a lie too bloated to hold itself up. Now, the hill is different. We rebuilt, not with rules or committees, but with cooperation. People who never spoke to me before now share tools, trade food, watch each other's kids. The ocean took everything that was fake and left behind what was real. Last week, Marcy's little girl asked me, "Mr. Calvin, is the tide gonna come back?" I paused, looking out over the marsh where her neighborhood used to be. "It always comes back," I said. "But now, we know how to stand our ground. Because sometimes, the flood doesn't destroy you. It just washes away the lies."